over the course of several years, I've sponsored quite a few podcasts. You've seen many of them on the slide here. Some are well known, some are very, very, very tiny, and some are very, very focused. But the key thing that all successful podcasts have is the hosts are very passionate about their content and the passion they do. And I think that's the key thing that really makes it a success. It's in some ways it's like old-time radio. You have a very intimate connection with the host. And one of the reasons podcast sponsorship work is we all live in an era where everyone is fighting for a little piece of our time and attention. The thing about podcasting is that, as Gene was saying, if you're listening, if you're driving a car or wherever, you're voluntarily giving your time and attention to that host and the other people in the panel. So that's why if sponsorship type of message is presented, it really goes straight into people's conscience. Dare I say, it goes straight into their soul if they have a really trusted relationship with the host. So at Drobo, we started, back-ended into a podcast. We started doing sponsorships in November, December of 2007, and it was really just an experiment. We had launched a product in June of that year, and what's the biggest challenge that all companies, especially new startup companies, have? It's getting known. And we had targeted a number of markets, and we used some of the podcasts because we had identified in our go-to-market planning that there was a high set of really high-tech alpha geeks we thought were appropriate for the market. And we experimented using podcasts to get to them, and it worked out. And then if something works in business, what do? You add more water, fertilizer, step and repeat, do it over again, and that's ultimately what we did. It became very, very successful. So on the sponsor side, there are really only a couple things that the sponsor's really looking for. They're really very, very the first thing they want is they want to sell their product. If they can't sell their product, then the second thing maybe they want is increased awareness. And common to both of these, they want to have some sort of proof that it works. This is the dreaded ROI. And one thing I always look for is, since our product was never available in any one exclusive location, and as a result, we look for podcasts where ideally you have a blog that's an accompaniment to your podcast site, so that you can leave footprints. You want to leave tracks so that the sponsor can see that people are coming in, they're coming from the sponsored site, and they come in, and ideally you see they're spending time looking around the site, see where they're exiting, if they exit on the where to buy page. This is all very, very, very good. Because sometimes you can create special promotional codes to offer certain listeners certain discount. This has pros and cons. Number one, it can't, for a physical product, where you have distribution in the retail world, you have no guarantee that you're going to use that instead of buy somewhere else. So as a result, you need to look for other indirect measures. So very much, for working with sponsors, they can look at sales and they can see all the appropriate buying activity, the tracks that you're leaving for that. But also, traffic that you drive to the website is a sort of soft ROI factor that's indicating that they're getting something, or at least getting awareness from the listeners. Turning the tables, what you as podcasters offer is you offer the host access to your audience. Maybe very, very narrow audience, very topic, maybe broad topic, but really what the sponsor is doing is they are piggybacking off of your relationship with your audience, and they're trying to wrap themselves up in that. Ideally, they'll bask in the reflected glory of the relationship you have with your listener. How do you find sponsors? That's the old question. It's how do you find a date or a husband? And some ways, just look at places that are familiar to you. I recommend that the products that you use, hardware, software, online services, things that you read, those are good places to start. The reason is because podcasting is such an intimate medium. If you talk about a product or a service, your listeners will be able to tell right away. They'll know if it's coming from your heart, and they'll know if you believe it, versus if you're just reading a message sponsor. And in selecting and working with hosts, you really want something where you have that sense of authenticity, because your listeners can tell, and you don't want to violate and damage your relationship with them, by just taking any old service you may or may not care about. Thing to remember when approaching a sponsor is that since you're offering access to your audience, you should open and have your discussions with them in terms of how you can help them sell their products, because ultimately that's what they want, right? So I can't tell you some of the lame examples of people requesting sponsorships where they don't understand this cardinal rule. They're not doing it because they like you or your cause. Sponsors will write a check to a podcaster because they can help augment their ability to sell. So if you offer access to a huge audience, like David Sparks does, that's one thing. If you offer a very narrow audience, that's very, very particular, you should understand that and put yourself in this frame of mind of how that's going to help sponsors sell their products into the people that are listening and following. At the end of the day, you need to make it a triple win. So for your listeners, you just don't want to come across and spam them with advertising, because that will hurt you, that will damage you and your relationship with them, but also doesn't hurt the sponsor, because it doesn't help the sponsor wants you to be in this reflected relationship that you have with your listener. So how you present it is sometimes a work of art. Some of the shows I presented, I'd asked people for the opportunity to sponsor, and the hosts have said no. That's really interesting. Waving money at them, and they say no. Figure out what it means. It comes back, and ultimately, the sort of sponsorship we were looking for at Drobo of a host-read message, in some cases would interrupt and distort the flow of the podcast. But then they've come back with either ideas for different shows or a different idea of how to present things in sort of an NPR educational. So that's the key thing, is that you can be very creative in how you present your listener without it sounding like a hard sell, late night TV infomercial. So ultimately, if you make it successful for your listeners, they'll buy the product, and then that will help us. The other thing that's important is, because it's your listener and the sponsors coming in and becoming a host, in my experience, it's very common that the host will get much more emails and commentary from podcast listeners. So they'll give love letters, and make sure that you pass that on to the host, because again, that goes back to some of the social ROI, because it may not always be possible to justify the strict dollars.